So again, welcome. My name is Kristen Lays, and I'm the Executive Director of Belle Grove Plantation in Middletown, Virginia. And Belle Grove is a site of enslavement. It was founded by the Height family in the 1780s. And while they owned the property and farmed it as a grain, primarily grain and livestock plantation, they enslaved 276 individuals in their time between the 1780s and the 1850s. So we are researching that very actively and do have some archival records that we've been using for that research. However, those have only gotten us so far in understanding what life was like for the enslaved, where they lived, what they ate, what they did. And so we were so fortunate that in fall of 2014, I got a call from Matthew Greer, and he was at Montpelier as a fellow working in their archaeology program on their enslaved quarters and work sites. And he asked if he might do similar work at Belle Grove. We had a little bit of work done in the past, but not a detailed analysis of where the enslaved lived at Belle Grove. And we have no standing enslaved quarters and haven't for many, many decades. So Matt began work with us the summer of 2015. After reviewing all the previous research, he felt like he had something to go on and has been working with us every summer since. And I will let him fill you in a little bit more on the trajectory of his research, where he is in his research. And we're just really delighted that he's joined us today and that he can tell us some of the really interesting finds and additional really interesting analysis he's been able to do. So I present to you Matt Greer.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be screen sharing a PowerPoint, but I've not done this before in Zoom, so hopefully this works pretty well.
Do you see on the bottom share screen? Okay. And if you want to make that slideshow presentation.
Is that good now?
That looks
okay.
Great. Thank you, Matt.
All right. So again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Greer, and I've been doing archaeological research and running the archaeological research at Belle Grove since 2015. And we are finally at a point where we are able to start telling the public about a lot of the information that we've been getting out of our research at the site. And I say our and we because it's not only myself doing this work, but also a whole team of researchers and many people who are doing their own research based on the collections that we've recovered. But one of the things that I focus on particularly are the ceramics that we found at the site. And we have found over 11,000 tiny sherds of ceramic. And a lot of them are kind of tiny and small, like you can see in this image here. But when we start looking at all of these together, we can get a really good understanding about the lives of enslaved people at Belle Grove. And just a quick introduction for those of you who are not from the area or have not been to Belle Grove before. Belle Grove is located in southern Frederick County, Virginia, which is in northern Virginia and in the Shenandoah Valley region in particular. And as Kristen mentioned earlier, Belle Grove was a wheat and cattle plantation owned by the Height family. The property was first acquired by Isaac Height Sr. in the mid-18th century, although as far as we can tell, he didn't do too much with it during his ownership of it. And in 1783, when his eldest son, Isaac Height Jr. got married, he gave the property to him. Isaac Height Jr. moved to the property with his new wife, and in 1783, the couple paid taxes on 16 enslaved people, which would increase to 23 enslaved people by 1787. And by the 1810 census, they were enslaving 103 people. So that's a lot of people that they were enslaving. And this number would stay fairly consistent at about 100 into the mid-1820s. And it's important to point out that the Heights didn't just own Belle Grove. They owned 4 properties. Belle Grove was one of them. They also owned the Long Meadow Plantation, which had been Isaac Heights Seniors Plantation. It's just south of Belle Grove. They also had another property called Rockville, which was just north of Belle Grove, and a plantation in Clark County called Guilford. It's over by White Post, if you're familiar with Clark County. So while the Heights enslaved over 100 people, they were divided between these properties, and we don't think any more than maybe 40 or 50 people were ever held at Belle Grove itself. And through the 18 teens, the number of enslaved people again stayed fairly constant, because as the Heights got new enslaved people, and as the people they enslaved had children, they were giving enslaved people away to their adult children. So the numbers are going to stay fairly constant. And this changes dramatically in 1824, when the Heights chose to sell 60 enslaved women, children, and men into the interstate slave trade. And based on, I've looked at this point, hundreds of advertisements for the sale of enslaved people, and no sale in the Shenandoah Valley is as big as this. So this was either the largest sale of enslaved people that ever occurred in the valley, or if not, it's one of the largest. So it's a massive event. And after this point in time, the number of people at the Heights enslaved went down dramatically. And by 1850, there were only 15 people enslaved at Belle Grove. And today, Belle Grove is owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And it's a public site, you can go and visit it. And because of that, there's been a lot of archaeological research on the property. And this has been focusing on trying to get information that we can use to bring to the public to help educate people about Belle Grove. And the archaeological work started in the 1970s, but for the next 25 years or so, almost all of it was focused on the area around the manor house. And this isn't unusual for early plantation archaeology. We tend to see most sites focusing on the enslavers and their homes and and the area around them. And it wasn't until the 1990s that archaeologists from James Madison University were doing some work on the manor house, and they had some extra time and money left over. So they decided to look in the field across the street from the manor house. And there's some Civil War era documents suggesting that there's buildings in that area. And what they ended up finding, amongst other things, is a large quartering site that today we call Quarter Site B. And after they found the site in the 1990s, they didn't really do much else with it. There wasn't money to do any research on it. And the site just sat there for the next 20 or so years. And until about 2015, when after I contacted Kristen about coming to do archaeology at Belle Grove, I started doing some initial testing at the quarter site to see if it had research potential, if I could use it for my dissertation, essentially. And so we did, in total, we did about 5 years worth of work out there. And so we ended up finding that it is probably the main quartering site for Belle Grove. It's a very large site. It covers about 1.5 acres. And we also think there might be 5 individual houses out there at least. So it seems to be big enough to hold most of the people that would have been held at Belle Grove itself. And based on the artifacts that we're getting from the site, it seems like it was initially inhabited in around 1800, and people stopped living there around 1850, which fits really well with what we know about the history of enslaved people at Belle Grove. In their 5 years of research on the site, we ended up finding, we ended up digging 117 3-foot by 3-foot units. And these are these square holes that you see across your screen here. And through these, we excavated over 1,200 cubic feet of soil. And we ended up finding over 53,000 artifacts, which is a lot. I don't have the final numbers because it's taking us a long time to go through and process everything. The basic adage in archaeology is that for every hour you're going to spend in the field, you're going to spend at least 3 hours in the lab afterwards. We spent a lot of time in the field, so there's a lot of lab work that has to happen now. And it's just taking us a long time to get through everything. We'll be doing work on these collections for years to come before we have all the information squeezed out of it. And before I start talking about the ceramics in particular, it's important to take a step back and talk about a different type of artifact that we're getting from the site. And these are food remains. And The Heights, like most enslavers throughout the Americas, only gave enslaved people about a peck of cornmeal and 3.5 pounds of salted pork a week. And a peck of cornmeal is about 2 gallons. And this amount of food was not enough to meet enslaved people's caloric needs. If they only ate this, they would have been hungry all the time. So most enslaved people in the Shenandoah Valley and in the Americas broadly did things to get food for themselves. We have evidence for this at Belle Grove. We have evidence that enslaved people were going into the woods around Belle Grove and getting walnuts and wild plums and hunting small mammals. We're getting frog bones, but they're not animals, also possibly possum and rabbit. We have evidence of enslaved people at the sites raising poultry. We have chicken bones and turkey bones, and we have eggshells from chickens and ducks. And the important thing to note about all this food that you see on the screen right now is all of this is stuff that the enslaved people got for themselves. None of this is stuff that the Heights gave them. So with this, we have good evidence that enslaved people are having their own gardens. They're getting food from the environment around them. They are raising animals. And this would have been a tremendous amount of work that enslaved people put into feeding themselves. Because for enslaved people, they were working for the Heights sun up to sundown 6 days a week. So to have a garden would mean having to drag yourself to your garden at night after working in the field all day to be able to get enough food for yourself and your family. So this is a tremendous amount of effort that enslaved people put into feeding themselves. And surprisingly, not only were enslaved people often able to get enough food for themselves and their family, but many had more food than they needed. And when this happened, many enslaved people chose to sell that extra food. We have archival records of enslaved people selling ducks and chickens to the Heights, and records of enslaved people at other plantations selling food to local merchants. This is probably something that people at Belle Grove did as well. And when we think about enslaved people and money, oftentimes we think about enslaved people buying themselves out of slavery. But this wasn't a very feasible option most of the time. And we can talk about this later on if people want to. But instead, most enslaved people chose to buy things to help them survive slavery or to make their lives just a little bit more bearable. And we've recovered tens of thousands of consumer goods from the quarter site. But one of our most common is ceramics. And again, we've recovered over 11,000 ceramic sherds from the site. And we can broadly group these ceramics into 2 categories. We have imported ceramics that are made outside the Shenandoah Valley and shipped into the region. And we have locally made ceramics that are made in the Shenandoah Valley. And when we separate them out, we get 2 slightly different but overlapping sets of stories. So because of that, I want to focus on these 2 types of ceramics. But the first one I'm going to talk about are the locally made ceramics. And the image on your screen now is a selection of the locally made ceramics that we recovered from the site. You can see most of these are sort of red-bodied ceramics. But also if you go to antique stores around the Shenandoah Valley and see gray salt glazed stoneware, sometimes with blue painting on it, that's also locally made ceramic in the region. And most of these are utilitarian vessels. They are things made to store food or to help you make food. So you can think of these as the Tupperware of the 18th century. And the Shenandoah Valley had a thriving local ceramic industry. And it started in the 1760s and went through about 1900. And local potters in the valley made vessels that almost every single household in the region used on a daily basis to make and store food. And Belle Grove is really situated, it's the red star on this map, and it's really situated in the heart of this ceramic producing area. And while Quarter Site B was inhabited, there were at least 15 potters operating within 15 miles of Belle Grove. So there's a lot of potters in the area. And we have records that enslaved people in the valley were buying locally made ceramics. For instance, a woman enslaved by Robert Smith bought 2 crocks for herself, along with an ounce of cinnamon in the 1850s. We have other records of enslaved people going, this is just outside the valley, but going to Peter Bell's workshop in Hagerstown and buying vessels from him. So we can look at enslaved people and these locally made ceramics. With these locally made ceramics, we can see enslaved people as consumers. And this is really important because when we're talking about the local ceramic industry in the Shenandoah Valley, we're not just talking about an industry, we're talking about people. Individual people who were able to make a living because of these ceramics, or who were able to do things to help themselves survive because of these ceramics. And I think one of the artifacts that really helps to encapsulate this is this ceramic sherd that you're looking at on the screen here. This is a piece from the base of either a crock or a pan made by an unknown potter in Stevens City. And as this potter lifted the vessel off the potter's wheel, the clay was a little bit too wet, and it looks like his fingerprints got stuck in the clay. So we see 3 really well-defined fingerprints on this sherd. And this is a really good reminder that, again, when we're talking about ceramics, we're talking about individual potters, men who made a living making and selling pots. And they could only make this living because people were buying the pots that they made. And when we're talking about this particular vessel here, this sherd we're looking at, it's more to remember that this potter, we don't know who he was, but he made a living in part because an enslaved person decided to buy the vessel that he made. And that money they spent helped him survive, helped him make a living. And this is important because most of the time when we talk about locally made ceramics in the Shenandoah Valley, this has been a topic that historians and collectors have looked at a lot because the region really is famous for its local ceramic industry. We tend to talk about it in terms of white potters making vessels for white consumers. And research that other people than myself are doing right now are starting to look at the fact that we are seeing Black potters in the Shenandoah Valley. It's a good chance we're seeing enslaved potters in the Shenandoah Valley. For instance, all the potters operating in Stevens City, enslaved adult men that would have been an age where they could have worked in a potter's workshop. But we're also seeing that enslaved consumers have a real impact. And when we look at the Shenandoah Valley as a whole, about 20% of the region was enslaved. And when we compare these ceramics at Belle Grove to the ceramics found at the homes of white people in the Shenandoah Valley, we see that enslaved people are buying just as many locally made ceramics as white people are. So this would suggest, these 2 factors suggest that enslaved people in the Shenandoah Valley may have been buying about 20% of the pots made by local potters. And while this isn't enough for enslaved people to be sort of the most important contributors, consumers contributing to the local ceramic industry, it highlights the fact that the Shenandoah Valley's famous ceramic industry only became what it was because enslaved people contributed to it. They chose to spend money buying pots made by local potters. And this highlights the fact that when we look at Shenandoah Valley history, it's really important to consider the important contributions that enslaved people made to the region's history. Okay, so that's one of the stories we can tell using the locally made ceramics. There's one other story that I want to highlight today, and this has to do with where the ceramics were being bought. I've done a lot of archival research to sort of understand where the ceramic, understand how people were buying ceramics in the Shenandoah Valley. And based on this, sort of 2 things are showing up. The first is that a lot of people are buying pots directly from potters. And potters obviously operate in the town that they work in. So this means a lot of people are going to the towns that potters work in to buy ceramics. And when you compare merchants to ledgers for stores in towns with potters and in towns without potters, people are far more likely to buy locally made ceramics in towns with potters. And it seems that local potters don't like shipping their vessels out all that often. For instance, John Pittman, who was operating out of Stevens City, was shipping ceramics to Winchester because they were the biggest ceramic market. They needed to bring ceramics in to sell. But he was frequently having vessels break on him as they were in transit. because ceramics are fragile. And he was being charged for this by the merchant he was selling to. So this might explain why potters aren't liking to ship their vessels out to other towns. But regardless, if we can figure out what towns the pots that are coming from Belle Grove were made in, then by extension, we can figure out where the enslaved people are going to buy these pots. And there's a variety of methods that we can use to assess this, and I'm working on 3, but only one of them is ready to start talking about at the moment, and this is neutron activation analysis. And Kristen teased this in the abstract for the talk. And what this is that I took tiny samples from 100 different pots from quarter site B, and I ground them up really fine with a mortar and pestle. They then got put into glass tubes that were vacuum sealed. These glass tubes sat in the reactor pool of a nuclear reactor for about a week. After a week, they were pulled out, put in a nice lead-lined room for about another week or so until we could safely handle them for a limited amount of time. These tubes were then put in front of a detector. This detector would count how much energy was coming off, how much radioactive energy was coming off these samples at different wavelengths. And different elements will send out energy at different wavelengths. And because of that, there's a set of complex mathematical formula that I don't fully understand because someone else did this for me, that we can take these energy signatures and figure out how much of which elements these samples are made of. So just as a quick example, we can see these 2 samples I'm highlighting on the left and the right both have about 9.6% aluminum and around 9.4% iron, whereas the sample in the middle has about 1% more aluminum and 1% less iron. And this is important because every single clay deposit in the world has a unique elemental signature to it. Unique ratios to different elements. And this is created by the type of bedrock it's weathering out from and other geological processes that have affected it over millennia. So if we can figure out what the elemental signature of clay deposits around Winchester, Stephen City, and Strasbourg are, then by extension, all we would need to do is match up the Belle Grove ceramics with those elemental signatures, and we know what towns they were coming from. So to do this, I took samples from pots that we know for a fact came from Winchester and Stephen City and Strasbourg. And I'd like to thank the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, Newtown History Center, and John Adamson for providing these samples. And I treated them in the same way, broke them down into a powder, put them in the nuclear reactor, took them out, looked at their energy signature. And using this, I was able to establish different elemental signatures for different clay deposits in Winchester, Stephen City, and Strasbourg. And then I was able to match the Belle Grove ceramics to these elemental signatures. And of the 100 vessels that we tested, I was able to say fairly conclusively where 90 of them were made. 1 vessel ended up being made outside the Shenandoah Valley, and the other 9 were ambiguous. We weren't quite able to figure them out. And there's a variety of things we can do with this information. But the one I want to talk about today is looking at where it changes over time in terms of where pots are coming from. So if we look at the ceramics earlier on, so the ceramic vessels that are made and bought before 1837, we see they're coming from 3 towns. They're coming from Winchester and Strasbourg, but they're predominantly coming from Stephen City. And Stephen City was the dominant ceramic manufacturer in the Northern Valley at this time, so this makes sense. When we jump forward in time and we look at the ceramics that were made after 1837, all of them that we tested came from Strasbourg. So one way of describing what we're seeing is that there's a restriction over time. Over time, enslaved people are going to fewer places to buy ceramics. And this is something that's really interesting on its own. It's something about where enslaved people are moving to around to buy ceramics, but also when we start coupling this with other lines of evidence, we get a really important picture of what's going on in the Shenandoah Valley with slavery over time. But to see this, we need to look at the imported ceramics. So we're going to come back to this in a minute, but we're going to come back to it via the imported ceramics. And the imported ceramics at Belle Grove are generally ceramics that look like these two on your screen here. These are ceramics generally with a white body, and they are almost entirely made in England and shipped into the valley through a whole series of merchants. And one of the fun things about these is most of our imported ceramics have easily identifiable decorative designs on them, like this blue floral pattern that you're seeing here. And one interesting trend that we've noticed in the imported ceramics is that a lot of them, 40% of them, are teawares. And in fact, the two vessels that you're looking at here are a teacup and a tea saucer from a matching set. And when we talk about this with people, there's always this question of where are the teawares coming from? Are these things that the enslaved people are getting secondhand from the heights? Or are these things that the enslaved people are buying on their own? And we have records of enslaved people in the Shenandoah Valley buying teacups and saucers for themselves. So we know that this was happening. And when we look at enslaved sites throughout the Americas, we commonly see teaware showing up. So this isn't an anomaly. But we still have this question of, can we figure out which individual vessels from the quarter site enslaved people were buying and which they weren't? So I looked at this past summer by taking all of our ceramics from the quarter site and comparing the decorative patterns on them to the ceramics from the manor house. And this is where luckily we have decades of research on the manor house, so we can just take and easily compare to the quarter site. So I focused on the decorative patterns and using a kind of a basic analysis where we have this decorative pattern on these two vessels. If we see the same decorative pattern show up at the quarter site and the manor house, then it's possible that the vessel from the quarter site came from the manor house. If we have a case where the decorative pattern at quarter site B does not match the manor house, then it's most likely a case where, say, people were buying that vessel on their own. This isn't a perfect system because it does involve a number of assumptions, but at least gives us a rough sense of how enslaved people were getting individual ceramic vessels at the site. And one thing that we started noticing really early, or I was noticing really early on this, is that there's a lot of vessels with this particular pattern here. And this is called the Lattice scroll pattern. It was made by Josiah Spode II. There's over a dozen vessels from the manor house that have this pattern, and about 5 vessels from the quarter site that have this pattern. And as far as I can tell, this was a fancy dining set that the Heights bought in the 18 teens for themselves. This was their good china they would have when guests came over. We are seeing plates with this design. We are seeing serving dishes and even a soup tureen with this design on them. And despite the fact that they probably weren't being used all the time, because these were being used in these fancier settings, if a plate had a chip in it, it seems like the Heights were getting rid of that plate and getting a new one. Because when we compare all of the vessels with this pattern of the manor house, we're seeing small differences in color variation and the pattern over time. There's small changes in how the pattern works over time, and we're catching this archaeologically. And it seems like enslaved people are taking these plates that are going to be thrown away and using them themselves. In fact, because again, we're getting 5 vessels with this pattern from the site from the quarter site. And one example is this piece in, I think it's my hand, that you can see on the top left of the screen. And interestingly, these all seem to be plates, and they all seem to be earlier vessels based on their coloration. So it would suggest that enslaved people are getting some of these earlier vessels as the Heights are getting newer ones to replace them. So we know that some ceramics are coming from the manor house. And one of the ways that we can match these up is we have this area that's circled in red here on this shirt matches up with this area here from the manor house, and that's how we can tie these together. And the best way to sort of look at this on a large scale is just to do a basic comparison of the ceramics. And I've broken them down into two categories, pearlware and whiteware. These are technical terms that archaeologists use. So the only thing you need to know about pearlware is that it is never made after 1830. The only thing you need to know about whiteware is it is never made before 1820. So by breaking our vessels into these two categories, we can see earlier ceramic trends and later ceramic trends. That's the only thing to worry about with those two names right now. And when we look at our early vessels, we see that about 63% of them from the quarter site do not match up with the manor house, which would suggest that enslaved people were buying most of their vessels on their own. But when we look at our whiteware vessels or later vessels, we see an even split. Half the vessels seem to be things enslaved people are buying on their own. Half of them seem to be things that are coming from the manor house. So over time, it looks like enslaved people are relying more on vessels from the manor house than vessels that they buy themselves. Another way of describing this is that over time, it looks like enslaved people's ability to buy ceramics from the local market is being restricted. Which brings us back to the locally made ceramics, where again, over time, we see a restriction in terms of what enslaved people are buying and where they're going to buy things. And we're also seeing this restriction in archival records. I've looked at a dozen merchants' ledgers from stores around the Northern Valley. And in the ledgers from around 1800, entries for enslaved people in the ledgers make up about 3% of the total entries. When we're looking at ledgers from the 1840s and 1850s, enslaved people only make up 1% of the entries in the ledgers. So again, we're seeing a restriction over time. Enslaved people are less likely to buy and sell things over time. And this is all going on despite the fact that between 1800 and 1840, 1850, there are more enslaved people in the Shenandoah Valley. So it's not a decreased population causing that, it's something else. And this something else seems to explain why we have these three lines of evidence showing a restriction over time are laws about slavery. Throughout the 19th century, enslavers developed an obsessive paranoia about enslaved people having access to alcohol. They were terrified that if enslaved people were drinking, then they might be rebellious or they might be unmanageable. And it's possible that what happened with Nat Turner might happen in the Shenandoah Valley. So because of this, throughout the 19th century, we see enslavers developing new laws and new ways of trying to keep enslaved people from buying and selling things. Laws that limit when enslaved people can buy and sell, what they can buy and sell, who they can buy and sell from. And there's even laws trying to restrict enslaved people gathering in towns. There was a law in the 1840s, I believe, in Stephen City, where if an enslaved person was caught playing marbles on Sunday in town, they would be whipped. So there's these attempts to keep enslaved people from buying and selling things because there's fear that it might create something rebellious. And from our three lines of evidence, it looks like these laws that are being implemented are having real material effects on enslaved people's ability to buy things to make the slavery a little bit more bearable or to help them survive slavery. And this is an important thing to look at in the Shenandoah Valley, is how slavery changes over time. But despite this increasing restriction, this doesn't mean that everything was being restricted in the same way. And with this, we come back to our tea-wares. When we look at our pearlware tea-wares, early tea-wares, it seems like enslaved people are buying about 68% of them on their own. So this means that enslaved people are more likely to buy tea-wares than they are to buy other vessels, which again, the overall amount was 63%. And when we look at individual patterns, we get some interesting trends. All of the vessels that have blue Chinese style designs on them are vessels that came from the manor house. All the vessels that have blue hand-painted floral designs do not come from the manor house. So these are things that enslaved people are buying on their own. So we can see enslaved people having distinct taste preferences from the heights. And when we look at our later ceramics, interestingly, despite the fact that half of our overall ceramics are coming from the manor house, 59% of our tea wares are not. So enslaved people, despite these restrictions, are still finding ways to buy tea wares for themselves. And they're even still able to have their own taste preferences. For instance, all of our later blue and red decorated tea wares match up with the manor house, but none of our purple, black, or brown tea wares do. That includes this purple tea ware as a tea saucer with a cow on it that somebody at the quarter site selected and bought for themselves. So we can see, despite these laws changing, despite all of these restrictions happening on enslaved people, we're still seeing them as able to try to get things that they want for themselves to make their lives a little bit more bearable. And they have some amount of consumer agency to do this. Okay, so one of the other questions that we get about tea wares is, what were enslaved people doing with these? Were they drinking tea out of them? What was going on? And there's two lines of thought on this. We have records from the Shenandoah Valley of enslaved people buying tea. We also have records of enslaved people in the Shenandoah Valley buying coffee and even hot chocolate. So any of these tea wares could have been used to drink hot beverages. But historic tea wares are shaped a little bit differently than modern tea wares. And teacups historically tend to be a bit bigger than teacups we think about today. And saucers in particular were really different. When we think about a tea saucer today, we think about a small plate. But historically, they were closer to a small bowl. And you can see this in the top right-hand corner of your screen. This is an antique saucer. This isn't something from Belle Grove. This is something I bought at an antique store and accidentally dropped one day when I was washing it. But you can see just how deep this saucer is, and it worked really well as a small bowl. So it's possible that enslaved people, many archaeologists argue, were buying tea wares to use as tiny bowls, maybe to hold a sauce to dip ash cakes into. But we've never really been able to come up with an answer. Is it one or the other? In part because we just don't have good evidence for how these were being used. We have ideas, but no good evidence. And hopefully later this month or early next month, I'm hoping to be able to get evidence to answer this question. So I'm going to be doing some lab work that, in short, involves shining infrared lights at parts of the ceramic where residues from food or beverages may have absorbed into them. And based on the way that infrared light reflects back, it can tell us what types of molecules are in that area. So if we end up getting a molecule that has this energy signature that reflects back, that looks like the graph on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, that would indicate caffeine, because a caffeine molecule, because that signature is a signature of a caffeine molecule. So if we get this from our teacups and saucers, then this would suggest that they were being used to drink caffeinated beverages. If we don't get caffeine molecules, but we're getting molecules associated with food, then that would suggest that they're being used as bowls. So hopefully in a few months, I'll have all this data processed and we might get some fun results that will let us finally know how the enslaved people at Belle Grove were using the tea wares that they were buying for themselves. And that's all that I have for today, but I do want to point out again that all this work is made possible not only by Belle Grove, allowing me to do the work and helping get funding for the project, but by a whole bunch of people who have helped me out, both in the field and providing their expert knowledge. This is only a partial list here on your screen, but I do want to acknowledge that this is a team effort. And while I'm the one here talking to you today, everyone that's been involved in this research has allowed me to do this. So thank you. That is what I have.
Thank you, Matt. I failed to say at the start of the talk that Matt is a PhD candidate at Syracuse University. He is in a process now of completing his dissertation writing, and he and I are working together along with the team and panel of advisors to put some of this information and some of the artifacts on display at Belle Grove. So keep in touch with us. It's not an easy process designing an exhibit, especially one that contains so much interesting information and finds, but keep in touch and we'll certainly let you know when we are ready to share that. And now Matt is actually in residence at the University of Virginia. He's a Carter Woodson Institute Fellow, and that's an Institute of African American Studies. And we're delighted he's still in the neighborhood and able to consult with us and join us in these talks. We did have a question that came in, Matt, and that is, how have you been able to find these merchant records?
So that's a good question. And I found them by going through a bunch of the local archives. So there is one ledger in the county library in Edinburgh, and that is for a store in Mount Olive. But most of the ones that I found in the archives in the Hanley Regional Library. And if you go on their website and look at their manuscript collection, you can go through and see a whole bunch of archives. So I just went through, made a list of everything to look at, then just sat down the archives for days at a time and took pictures on my phone of every single page of every single ledger, and then sat at home and watched Netflix for about a year as I transcribed all the entries in them.
So this is a follow-up question also from Kimberly. She's the only employee at her museum, and she's researching enslaved people there. So she wondered if we had any contacts. She's in Georgia. So you described sort of, reaching out to just basically local historical societies and archives in our region. So, we're fortunate that we have 2 counties, both of which have made pretty good efforts in collecting local records and making them available to researchers. So that would be my recommendation, Kimberly, is you can reach out to your local historical societies. Matt made the leap between finding evidence of ceramics that were purchased, evidence in the Belle Grove records that showed enslaved people had maybe some small amount of money. So we knew they were selling poultry to the Height family, for example. So that kind of gave him the clue to go look for more. And he got the idea that maybe merchant records would be a source of information. So Matt, do you have any other recommendations?
Yeah, local archives are really, I think, the best way to go through and find these. Unfortunately, it can be hard if you want to find information on particular people. In all the work that I've done, I found a few entries for Height, Ann Height and James Madison Height, family members of Heights, who were buying and selling things, no information on enslaved people from Belle Grove itself. So it's sort of, you have to cast a wide net and look regionally and sort of get broad trends. But if you are looking at a family that has enough of a name in an area, you might be able to find it. But local archives are definitely the best way to go for that. They might know who is in some of the ledgers. Yeah,
so just to reiterate, I mean, Matt has never hit the jackpot in finding an actual name of an enslaved person from Belle Grove in one of these records. And that's what also, he had to do that extra work to look at a couple of other, to look at sources from a couple different counties to make sure that his theory was playing out, that his assumptions were correct. So let's see. We're lucky on the line. We have Nick Powers, who's the curator at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley and a great colleague of ours. He's posted a great link in the chat of a brand new article that's just been published about Shenandoah Valley ceramics. So if that's of interest to you, it's a free article. And then he also recommended that it's called the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. And their website is just Black Craftspeople plural, people.org. And he says it's mostly looking at, he says it looks largely at Low Country, and Tiffany Mauman, who operates it, would likely be able to point you to other resources that are Georgia specific. So it looks like South Carolina is its focus, but they may be a good place to tip you off to other Georgia resources. And I don't know if the state archives system in Georgia would be of help in this way too. They may have some statewide records to reference. Matt, you didn't really look at the Virginia level for this type of record, had you?
Not yet. I was going to go to the Library of Virginia, but then COVID happened and haven't made it.
Yeah, so that that's another factor of life, and but another reason to make sure you've looked at all your local resources first. We had another question, and if you have questions, feel free to just put them in the chat, and we'll let Matt know about them. So this is from Benita. She said, "Why did the Heights sell off a large number of their slaves?" And I have my theories. You want to share if you have yours?
So we're not sure. One of the things I've been doing for my dissertation is trying to look at the relationship between changes in the flower market and increases in numbers of sales. And we look at overall patterns. There was a giant market crash in 1819. And it seems like the pattern over and over again is enslavers would wait until the market started to do better before they sold off people. And it seems like the market was probably starting to get better around then, so they were probably selling off people to pay debts that they had incurred for the last few years before then.
Yeah, so that's really interesting information, and it sort of verifies some of the theories that the Belle Grove staff and volunteers have come up with analyzing our archival records. We knew the Height family had struggled in the Panic of 1819, and the sale was in 1824. So we suspected that had something to do with it, but also that timing of about 1824 was when Isaac Height Jr. of Belle Grove was aging. His children were sitting out on their own, getting married, starting their own households, their own businesses, and he may have been, in some senses, downsizing or liquidating assets in order to help his children or help himself. So the timing is interesting for that reason too in their personal lives. Matt, there's a question from Marie that are there evidence of free Black involvement in the enslaved buying and selling in the area?
So to clarify, is this the question about free Black people buying and selling commodities or buying and selling enslaved people?
Let me read that. See. I'm not sure, Marie. If you want to clarify, I'm going to guess that it's in commerce.
So yes, I have some information for free Black people in the area buying and selling things. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the biggest handle on that. But if this is a topic that interests people, there is a ledger for a store in Middletown that does record multiple free Black men selling grains to Edward Sperry, a merchant. So it is there. I chose not to look at it as much. Sometimes you need to actually get into who these people are by comparing tax records and census records. And I just didn't go into that at the moment.
But it is an interesting line of inquiry that Belle Grove is really interested in. Yeah, I mean, Matt needs to stay kind of laser focused on his research topic, but we are very curious to know what the free Black population was like, what their involvement with the plantation was like. We do have evidence that a free Black, at least one free Black person had a relationship with an enslaved woman at Belle Grove, and there were children that came out of that relationship. So it's an interesting story we're currently researching. And it's also one, like Matt has mentioned, that we envision will have changes over time. There may have been times when that was more fluid, those relationships were a little more easygoing, and then as time goes on and laws become more constraining on people's freedoms, that could have changed. Stephanie wants to know, what have you discovered architecturally about the quarters, how they were constructed? Are there any foundations left?
So unfortunately, we don't have any foundations. In our excavations, we ended up we excavated one house site extensively, and we ended up putting a trench through that, and we were not able to find any foundations. So we think they were probably raised up on stone piers. There's a lot of exposed bedrock in that area. So they might just be resting on exposed bedrock, or maybe on a rock or two. We found a lot of brick, and my suspicion is that the houses out there had brick chimneys. And we also found evidence that they are probably log cabins. So probably log cabins with brick chimneys. The one home we did excavate had a gigantic 9 by 12 foot root cellar. So that's also like, we know because of that we're in the house area, but we just haven't unfortunately hit any really solid architectural features besides that. If that answer is coherent, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, it's maybe obvious to people that you found a lot of daub. So that's, you're not necessarily finding the logs, but you find things that one would need to construct a log cabin.
You're finding like a clay mixture that was jammed in between the logs to keep wind from blowing through.
Mm-hmm. And Jen wonders how you came up with evidence that you think you found about 5 quarters. And she wonders if any remote sensing was done.
So our evidence is mostly coming from distribution of architectural materials, primarily nails. When we were doing testing sort of throughout the field, we didn't do any remote sensing, in large part because there's a lot of exposed bedrock in this area. And if we were to do remote sensing through ground penetrating radar, for instance, we would get a lot of false positives with just bedrock everywhere. So instead, we used a little bit of metal detector survey, and they can go through. We had them not dig anything in these areas, but listen to see if they're finding a concentration of nails. That might suggest a building. But we also dug what are called shovel test pits, or holes that are about 1 foot in diameter that we dig on a grid system throughout the site. And we've dug 471 of those throughout the field. And we can look at the artifacts from these holes and look and see, okay, there's nails in this area, so that's probably going to be a building there. And that is how we ended up suggesting where our 5 possible house locations are.
Do you want to talk about other technology you've used, such as LiDAR, drone photography? Is there anything else of note there?
Yeah, so we're using the we're trying to see what we can get. So we've had some drone photography taken. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be helping us too much with finding little bumps in the ground that could indicate a foundation or anything like that. But it will help us sort of create topographic models of the site that we can then take our information, put them on top of. We also tried looking at satellite imagery. This isn't myself doing this, but the sort of assistant director of the archaeology, Erica Moses, her master's thesis was looking at near-infrared satellite imagery to see if, essentially looking for infrared crop marks in the ground to see if that could tell us where any buildings were. But unfortunately, the results that she had, the satellite imagery didn't seem to be good enough for the fine-grained detail that we needed for that. So we've been trying, we just haven't come up with anything really good yet, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any last questions, anyone? Matt, any last thoughts? So what, I guess next steps that if you're interested in Belle Grove's research on this, Matt has concluded doing any archaeological field work. So whereas you may have seen the last several summers, we're in the field, we won't be doing that this year. So we're he's focused on doing a lot of this more of this background, archaeological research, a couple more scientific analyses, and then writing up his findings, and then we're working on our exhibit. So those are sort of the next things you can look for from Belle Grove. Of course, we're working on the physical exhibit, but as that is getting completed, since some of you do live outside of the area, or if we're continue to be constrained with COVID, we'll certainly plan concurrently things we can share online and through our website. Belle Grove our website is belle.org. And if you look on the About tab, then we have a link to our research on the enslaved. And we have some records there, some stories there. And we're constantly analyzing the archival records and learning things from that. And in fact, are starting a monthly newsletter where we feature one of the enslaved people and things that we're learning about their lives. So you can find that on the website as well. Any last thoughts, Matt?
No, I'm going to put my email in the chats in case anyone comes up with any other questions they would like to ask me. You can reach me at that email.
Appreciate that, Matt. It's very generous of you. Thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned, we did record this, and I will send out that link to everyone who registered. And you're welcome to share it with others. We'll probably also put the link up on our website. So thank you and have a very wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all for coming.